In making a strip piece scrappy Lone Star or star of any kind, once you start sewing your strips together, because a lot of the work that I do is scrappy, I might have, this probably was a leftover strip from a layer cake, I just continue adding on my strips as I go, and have several sections of that happening. I usually still always set my seam by ironing this section before I open it up, and I think that's a little bit more important when you have some loose ends in between, just to help set the seam and secure it and keep going from there. This is an example of a very long set. I had a 45-inch strip of white fabric but had several various sizes here. And one thing I always try and pay attention to is if I started sewing on this side, to turn around and sew the opposite direction in normal piecing, but with the Lone Stars it's a little bit more difficult. All my seams are staggered, so whatever the width of this strip is, which was 2 inches, I've offsetted it down 2 inches and 2 inches. So that's given me a long continuous strip, and you can see all the different reds. And you're going to have some waste. You're going to have, need to trim up some sections down here. And, obviously I came out a little bit short down here, but it scraps, and that's part of using all of that. One thing that's the kind of the hardest thing when you're making a Lone Star quilt or any type of star is cutting on the diagonal. It's easy to slip with your ruler, it's easy to get off, So one thing I do is use the lines on the mat instead of the cutting. So I'm going to put my edge of my fabric along my 45-degree line on my mat, and that's what I'm going to use as my cut marks. So you're going to cut the exact same, however wide this strip is how wide you're going to cut your cross cuts here. And by getting a straight line here, and I never use the actual lines on my mat as my marking, but I definitely use them as my lineup points. You can see how this line goes straight across the bottom of the ruler, and straight across here gives you the right angle that you need. And this mat's a little smaller than what I normally use, so forgive me for doing this a little cheating, but another trick that I like to do is, instead of my first cut being my 2-inch cut, I go ahead and double it. So I have a 4-inch cut, so that somewhat helps secure your fabric on this end. Holding your hand down good, always start below the fabric and cut up. And then I'm just going to move this ruler back over and down to 2 inches. So there's just something about having a little bit more fabric weighted underneath your ruler that doesn't make your fabric slip as much. So you have 2 perfectly cut strips. Now these edges are on the bias, so you do want to try and not handle them as much as possible, just to keep them from stretching. And again, depending on how long your strip is, you can line it up anywhere along these lines, just making sure you're on the 45 degrees, and continue to cut. So I can tell I have at least 2 more cuts here. And cut backwards. So to make the other sections of the stars, I'm going to have 2 lights and a dark as my center. And so I previously showed you how to just literally start cutting when you're on the 45 degree, but if that does make you a little bit uncomfortable and you want to make your first cut at 45 degrees, line up this piece along a straight edge using your ruler and lining up at 45 degrees. And again, I can tell I've shifted down some because of that selvage still showing there, I need to scoot a little bit. And this is where you would get your angle, and this is what most traditional instructions are for. But I just always get nervous to keep cutting at an angle, cutting at an angle, cutting at an angle. just because it's sometimes difficult to make and the ruler will slip. So then this is where I normally would then just turn it and start cutting and cut the whole length of your strip. If you're cutting it and you have had one of these sections that I showed earlier, you're obviously going to have a little bit of waste as you're getting down to here, and just cut away from it. Cut that little section away and keep cutting. This particular one, I am going to have a little bit of waste, but sometimes I'll use these as pieced borders, or go ahead and then cut them as straight pieces for another 9-patch or projects such as that. So cutting is usually the most difficult thing, but then also matching your seams, because you have literally an angle. You have one seam coming in at one direction, and then the back seam is coming in at the opposite direction. So I consider that section being an X, and to show you here, I've gone ahead and marked where my 1/4 of an inch line is, and if you stick your pin straight in there and over a 1/4 of an inch here and pin it, and the way you double check it is if you look inside your seam and open it up and you see an X, or you see that these 2 points match perfectly, by the time you sew them they're also going to match perfectly. Another way to double check that is once you start sewing, you should come in right as a V at the 1/4 of an inch, come all the way down, and you will also have a 1/4 of an inch at this end. And most likely it's a scant 1/4 of an inch, and remember that this is on the bias, so it does stretch some. So until you get the hang of it, it pays to go ahead and pin at all of your particular intersections. By cutting 2 of the darks with a light and vice versa, this is what my design ended up being, to where I had the dark combinations, the lights, and the darks, and you really get a really scrappy look and feel for what your stars are going to be. So this happens to be 4 different sections, and even though some of the same fabrics are used and some of the same placement, they're all in different places, so it definitely makes it a very sparkly star, keeps movement going, and your eyes, constantly looking at different things. An interesting thing about reds, I would have thought that all greens match because I love nature, and you look outside that all greens match, but in official color theory, supposedly all reds go together. And another little, fun fact is, if you're going out on a date and you want to wear a red dress, don't take a girl to help you pick it out, because she will tend to buy a more blue red, where men's eyes are attracted to more of an orange red. So, especially if you're going out looking for a date, we're more of the orange red. So anyhow, that's half of the star, and you could continue on from that, and then just have fun with what your backgrounds are going to be. But I just sewed tons and tons of just little strips like this together, and spend some time cutting them apart and sewing them back into star sections.